Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit, the newest and most reliable state-of-the-art time-traveling transportation service, is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is ancient Odyssey.
Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 14 of the podcast. This week, I had a wonderful conversation with my friend Rachel Finnell, who is currently a political science PhD candidate at the University of Kansas. So, naturally, as a Mizzou grad, I am required to say that KU sucks, and a big MIZ to all of my fellow Mizzou alumni currently listening. Nah, I'm just kidding. I love Rach despite her choice of institution. I really wanted to chat with her because she studies authoritarian regimes, and I thought it would be really important to chat about the relationship between modern and ancient political thought, how PoliSci and ancient studies majors need to work together to succeed, and ask about the possible misappropriation of historical symbols in authoritarian regimes to amass and hold power. While I had every intention of keeping things pretty serious, it's incredibly hard to do so because of how much fun we have when we talk. So I hope you'll love our banter as much as we did. Enjoy the episode, and I will speak to you all next time. So, Rach, thank you for joining me on the podcast today. I was really excited to have you on because it's a little different because you are not an ancient studies scholar. You are, in fact, a political scientist, which is awesome because I love political scientists.
We're just rays of sunshine these days.
I know, our guiding lights. So with that though, walk us back a little bit. How did you discover you loved political science? And that's a big umbrella, but for people who don't know, you study authoritarians, which is like super cool. So I want to give people a behind the scenes look at how does one just suddenly discover they like studying authoritarians?
Yeah. So, I get this question a lot. I get it from students who are like, why do you want to study dictators? Like, what made you interested in being a political scientist? What made you interested in understanding autocrats? And, for me, political science they were like my favorite courses during my undergrad. I went to the University of Central Missouri and I transferred there from a community college. And I remember I was majoring in economics and I loved it. But I always felt like political science was really my passion. And so I minored in political science and just fell in love with the courses and decided that I wanted to be a professor someday. So I took the jump and applied to graduate school and got into the University of Kansas, rock chalk. And I know, Lexie, you're a Mizzou grad, so we're supposed to be bitter enemies, but today we put that aside for the podcast. No, I'm kidding. But I got into the University of Kansas, and I just fell in love with the idea of these authoritarian regimes. I started in 2016. It's no coincidence likely that I started studying it in 2017 because I'd seen this push among the world to have more authoritarian leaders. I was fascinated by Vladimir Putin and other authoritarians around the world, and I'd grown up being fascinated by fascists as a kid. I loved reading about World War II, and I always wanted to understand why and how in the world these people came to power. Like, how did Hitler become a thing? How did Stalin become a thing? How in the world did we were we allies with the Soviet Union and with Stalin, given all of the terrible things that Stalin did? And it was one of those things that I realized after taking a class at KU over the summer at directed readings, that was what I wanted to do, that was my passion. And I just, went for it. And now I love it. It's so much fun. I get to do what I love every day. And I feel so grateful to be able to do that, because I know a lot of people can't necessarily say that, but I get to be a scholar and a student for my career. And then I get to do research about authoritarians and learn, all about them. And it's so much fun. And I've always just been fascinated by dictators. So that's sort of how it came to be. Yeah.
So dictators haven't obviously they're not a new invention. They go way back to the earliest civilizations. So I would say politics, more than a lot of other career fields and areas, are super interconnected with the ancient world. And so did you, over the course of your undergrad years, take any ancient studies courses? I mean, maybe study like ancient political thought or some sort of ancient civilizations course, because I've got to imagine that the level of political intrigue back then, I mean, it's bonkers, but it sets kind of the roadmap for all the modern ones, right?
Right. I'm trying to think back to my undergrad years and the courses that I took. And I took a political ideologies of political theory course. And so you go back into, really early stuff, Plato, Aristotle, etc. And I was fascinated by that class. I loved it. I loved reading all of these different theory that just, it blew my mind. I was like, this is so cool. That sort of really ignited that passion and that intrigue inside me. But I also took, some world civilizations courses. I never took any courses beyond that, but it was most of like more historical, sort of seeing how the civilizations of the world have progressed over time from origin to where we are now-ish, right? As close to now as you get in a general history course. So, yeah.
So obviously sometimes it's just not readily available, or it really doesn't, it doesn't need to be studied then. I suppose there's so many different reasons why places may or may not offer ancient courses, especially for people going into politics. But do you find yourself at all, now that you're in grad school, maybe not for a class per se, but do you find yourself needing or wanting to do some research on some ancient cultures if you see a particular similarity between, hey, I don't know, Putin kind of seems like what he's doing, hey, that mirrors like Augustus or something? Do you find yourself wanting to go back, pick up a book and say, all right, let me see what Augustus did so I can compare it to the modern stuff?
I mean, history and examples from the past are so critical in our understanding of where we're at now, right? History always says, this is not my quote by any means, but history has a way of repeating itself, right? So if you really want to understand how someone is coming to power, right, and their behavior, that history is important to understand. I mean, in a lot of ways, if you look at the political culture of many of these countries, it's that history, it's that context of each country, or even, autocrats could have their favorite historical figure who they want to embody, right? So to understand that behavior of like Vladimir Putin or something, it's so important to understand the context and the past, because they're not inventing something new. This isn't like just all of a sudden we were like, wow, well, we've never had a dictator before Hitler, therefore it's like it's so important to understand the past and to understand previous dictators, previous emperors throughout history, to really understand where we are now and how we get to the current autocrats, the current dictators.
So you mentioned Hitler a couple times now, and obviously he is one of the most fascinating figures to study if you like studying fascism. And
right.
I don't want to say you. Okay, certain people, some of us actually like studying fascism, which is kind of some horrible masochistic thing we do to ourselves. But you've mentioned him now, and so I think a lot of people don't know that Hitler was a classicist. Hitler really admired a lot of the ancient writers, which that shocks so many people. And I think when I first learned that, it shocked me. But then after a couple of years of study and serious research, I said, no, that's not actually that shocking anymore. But because he tried to make his Third Reich the new Roman Empire, essentially, taking after all these imperialistic ideas, because he essentially didn't make anything up. I mean, he got all of his stuff looking at the classical world since he loved it so much. Do you think that as a teacher yourself now, is it important to perhaps integrate some of these ancient studies courses more into modern political courses? I mean, if you really want to study Hitler, wouldn't you want to study with where he got his ideas and his influences, which essentially are ancient Rome and ancient Greece?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I talk about Hitler because unfortunately or fortunately, depending on, most people know who Hitler is, right? Like it's a really good sort of example. Like this guy was bad. He did all of these bad things. And most people also know, Vladimir Putin and other autocrats. But I think having that context is so useful. Tying in sort of this background to like the origins of this ideology, to the origins of the symbolism, to the origins of the purpose of like wanting to build and create this massive empire, right? That's important. It's not just that he did bad things. Like, how did he get there? How did he get to this point where he decided this is what I want? And I think that could be really useful in the classroom to highlight not just the political science aspect, but to highlight beyond political science, to tie in other disciplines, this interdisciplinary nature of authoritarian regimes, of dictators. Yeah.
And I think for a lot of universities with funding and other issues, we really sort of don't like to think about things being interdisciplinary unless it's some of the bigger, more, I don't want to say
Right.
important because it's all important, but visible things. You're in Lawrence, Kansas right now.
Yes.
So you teach at KU. It's okay if you don't know, but have you seen any sort of advertisement or general showcasing of the KU Classics program, or do they do a decent job of kind of broadcasting, hey, we're here, you can come take classes, like we do have a department, or do you just kind of not see that around campus?
I don't recall seeing that around campus, with the caveat that I was stuck most of the time in Blake Hall, in my office, and I didn't really venture out a whole lot. Occasionally I'd walk around campus to, get fresh air and grab food and coffee. But because of that, I didn't really see a lot of the advertisement or the push for those sorts of courses. But that could have been because I just wasn't really looking for it, or I wasn't in the right space.
But that also kind of affirms what most of us in the humanities know, which is we do a terrible, like such a shit job at actually broadcasting.
Right.
When you talk about the accessibility of these courses and of these programs so that people who do want to go into bigger things like political science, it seems like we're really forcing students to be industrious and find something on their own that if no one told them it exists, they're not going to have it. Very select programs all over the country where it is more visible because they're bigger, they have more funding, they just have that overall higher level of notoriety. I mean, if you look it up on the internet, you'll find, do you want to join the Harvard Classics program or the Yale one or Hopkins or something?
Right. Ivy League, big name schools, of course. Yeah.
For PoliSci, it's huge, but there's so many different subfields that you can go into.
Right.
Do you see, is it kind of tiered the way ancient studies are, where maybe there's the bigger, more popular areas within PoliSci to go to versus like the smaller, more niche places where they don't talk about it at all?
I think that really depends. And I think I'm trying to think of examples in my life. There's, of course, those big name schools that everyone knows, Harvard, Stanford, Yale. Those political science programs are, top notch, up there. But I don't think political science, and at least in my experience, I can speak to my own experience. Other people may have experienced something different, but I don't think political science has had that same sort of visibility issue. I think if you go to certain state schools or smaller schools, then that's when you'll start to experience that political science is not as taken as widely. Some programs don't have nearly as high enrollment, but it's likely what students are going to that school for are maybe different than political science. Like if they're going to go study political science, they may go to a larger institution in general, based on internships or connections or opportunities, and that might be what they do, versus a smaller school where they may not necessarily get that same sort of connection and opportunities.
For sure. And obviously those are like really big, weighty questions where there's not going to be a right answer, and
Right.
it's obviously different based on experience for people. But
Right.
it's always interesting to just see, what have you personally seen versus what do we perceive as maybe issues, maybe not. I don't know. So
Right.
it's
And I think the one thing about political science that a lot of people, when I tell people I study political science, they think all I do in graduate school is sit around and talk about politics. And listen, I enjoy politics. Politics is fascinating to me, but by no means is that what we do every day. We talk about current events. We talk about all of these different things occurring in the world. But it's so much more than just sitting around having these debates about a single politician or a single political party. It's so much more than that. And I think that might be a common misconception about political science that's inaccurate. Like we do talk about politics, but that is not the purpose of studying political science.
Yeah, I mean, hey, if you want to just bust through some of those misconceptions, I'm happy to let you do so, because I can't tell you how many people they're like, why would you want to go do that? Then that sounds so awful, so boring. Don't you just sit around and like read the news all day? Like, how does your head not pop off?
Yeah. I mean, listen, the news is important. And I have my students participate in current events discussion and current events assignments where they go and seek out information happening relating to concepts that we're learning in class, right? So as a political scientist, I am focused in two areas, but my research generally focuses in one. So I study comparative politics, which is the politics of domestic like systems, domestic, whatever's occurring within a country, right? Whether it be, are you what's the makeup of your legislature? What kind of executive do you have? Do you have a president? Do you have a prime minister? How is your judicial system built up? What about the political culture? So that is like the in the United States, our political culture is based a lot around freedom and liberty, individualism, and a few other like equality, not economic, but political equality, and a few other things. And public opinion, we look at like what do people think about these sorts of things. But within comparative politics, I study institutions, which is the legislature, the executive, et cetera. But I do that within authoritarian regimes. The other area that I majored in is international relations, which is just the interaction between countries. What causes war? What results? How does trade happen politically? Different things like that. But we sit around and we talk about and learn about legislatures, or do you have a unicameral system, which is one house? Do you have a bicameral system, which is two houses? What does that mean for the sorts of output that you have? Why is it that Congress is so slow? All of these different things. We don't sit around and talk about politics and like Republicans versus Democrats. We sit around and go, how did we get here? How did this emerge? Why is it that this is important and necessary to understand? How does it work, right? Like government can be, really mystical and sort of like difficult to understand, but it's actually, if you sit down and look at the mechanisms, it's not nearly that as difficult to understand. But we don't talk about politics every day. We don't have grand debates over presidential candidates in classes or things like that. No, we talk a lot about, what's going on in each country, and with respect to public opinion and protests, and how do these things come to be, instead of what's actually occurring today. You can use that in the classroom and outside of the classroom to understand what's likely to happen later or what are the origins of this, but we don't sit and just yak about politics every day.
I think that's actually really comforting to know, because a lot of people I meet, they go, "You're working in politics now," or "Oh, you're so political. Why weren't you a poli-sci major? Like, what were you doing with your life?"
Yeah.
And I think it's, I mean, I didn't know, I suppose, the intricacies of what getting the major and what kind of classes you have to take, but I kind of knew. I just said, I like what I like is the short answer. And so to wade through classes of things that I wouldn't particularly, they're interesting for sure, but that I wouldn't probably find useful for my own future, I'd be like, I don't really want to take this. So hence I did not go into poli-sci. I didn't minor in it. And
you got to do what you love. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, well, if you don't do what you love, I mean, what are you doing with your life, right?
Yeah. I mean, you're just probably miserable or sad.
Well, it's something I address quite frequently on the podcast. I think when I talk to people, we kind of have this idea of one of the turnoffs of the humanities to a lot of people is, I'm not going to get a job. I'm going to be poor. It's a waste of my time because I can't do anything with that. And what often ends up happening is I get a lot of comments like, "Oh, of course. I mean, I love this general insert topic. Let's use politics. Honestly, I love politics. I love ancient politics more than I love modern politics, or I love studying the makeup of societies and political ideologies. Oh, but I would never, ever take a chance and do that by getting a classics major," because they say things like, "My parents told me I have to go make money so I can come off payroll." So what you get is a lot of people who are just convinced they have to be investment bankers, or convinced that they have to be accountants or something, money managers, I don't know, but then they just all look kind of silently desperate and just so depressed. And like,
if that is your passion, if you want to be an investment banker or an accountant, and I have some friends who are in the business world, and more power to you. That's great. If that's where if that's what you love and it pays the bills, and it just so happens to pay the bills rather well, congratulations. Great. Right. I think the sort of thing that gets missed when we talk about, the humanities or the social sciences that aren't the quote unquote money makers, is that, understanding the world through the context of some of these focuses is necessary to be a well-rounded individual. It's not just that you are, getting the job. You're going to get a job, right? Ultimately, it's not a matter of like this, having this degree equals no job, but it helps you think about the world differently. It helps build your critical thinking skills. It helps you have a better understanding of your place in all of this, right? And in many ways, you have skills that are different from someone who only looks at investment, right? Like if you are an investment banker, you're thinking numbers. But if you've been trained, in the humanities, maybe you're thinking numbers are great, but let's think about some of this other thing. So you have all of this different approach to the world that is so useful, and the world needs. I think a lot about STEM and this push to really get more women, especially people of color, into STEM. And it's great, and it's necessary, and it's important. God bless all of them, because modern medicine is a beautiful thing, and we will soon be all vaccinated and hopefully back to more normalcy in the future, thanks to STEM and thanks to modern medicine. They can diagnose sick people, right? They can diagnose when someone's sick, but humanities and social sciences can diagnose when society is sick. And there's so much more that we have to understand about the world. It's not just one-sided. And I wish that there would be more of a push to, instead of just focusing on the amount of money that you make, it should be this focus on, are you making enough money to survive? Yes, great. but are you feeling fulfilled? Do you enjoy what you're doing? Because that's really like the goal in life. Life is short. You might as well do what you love. And if you're miserable all of the time, that money isn't going to matter. I may be making a controversial statement. People may disagree with me, and that's your right. But I would rather be studying what I love and maybe not making as much money, but making more of an impact on the world than working some 9 to 5 job where I'm absolutely miserable but making a lot of money. That's my take on things.
Yeah, well, I couldn't have put it better, because usually I'm the one who diatribes about, everyone's going into STEM, and I think that's great. But you know what? You're doing it to the like exclusion, and just you're forgetting other things. I'm like, okay, everyone in STEM can literally, you can look at something and be like, okay, this is how we make something work. And I'm like, okay, but someone has to come up with the ideas to make your ideas work, right? You're not going to do it. You know the numbers. So if I say, let's cure world hunger, okay, so you could probably put things into practice, but you need somebody smart who studies world systems, the past, what worked and what didn't. I mean, if not, your numbers people are just going to be trying stuff, and who knows, it could be trying stuff that the ancients did, then found out that they didn't work, and then you've wasted 10 years.
Right. And I mean, beyond that, I think of the political science aspect is policy. How do you implement this new invention, this new thing? How do you create a distribution strategy for a vaccine that requires very specific things? How do you get people to buy into it? Whenever, right now there's some distrust of the vaccine. How do you do all of this? How do you create this sort of strategy to get out there and have it be effective? It's so much more than just, the science aspect of something. You have to have people who can help make sure that it's effective and that it works and that you're not doing something ineffective. Like,
I couldn't have laid it out better myself, dude. Honestly, like I'm so glad you went there with the vaccine, because I'm like, that's the perfect illustration though of this interconnected chain, right? So you can have your STEM people actually working on and making the vaccine, because that's what they know how to do. And then you need political scientists to come up with the policy and the implementation. How do you distribute? How do you do this? How do you work with the governments? Blah, blah, blah. And then the people who are going to try to do the like outward facing PR campaign are the people who know how to talk to other people, which is historians, us. I mean, we are the people that kind of bring it together, right? So that's this one big long chain of STEM, PoliSci, humanities, but it's all important because one step doesn't really work without the other, right? I mean, okay, so great. You have vaccine made, then you have people who know how to implement policy. If you can't convince anyone to take it, so then you have a vaccine that no one will take, even if you have a good plan to get it out. So that's like the perfect example right there that I can think of.
It's we're all a part of a system, right? We're all necessary in this system. Just because one is maybe more outwardly facing and more visible doesn't mean the rest of it isn't necessary. If you start taking things out of that system and you don't have humanities for diagnosing the system as good or bad, or being able to be more being able to apply things within the system, it can very quickly cause problems. And we're important, the humanities, the social sciences, we're here. We just want to make the world a little bit better and a little bit more exciting.
I also find it very sad that I feel like we're always having to argue and sort of justify why we're important, why we should exist. Do you know how many professions out there just like don't need to always have this justification? I feel like every political scientist friend I meet, or everyone who has ever majored in any of the humanities, after the first 3 things out of your mouth are going to be like, hi, nice to meet you. And then the 4th thing out of your mouth is, and here's why I'm going to justify you why what I studied is valid. Like,
so, and I think part of it, if you get down to why that is funding, right? So many programs, especially in higher ed, are facing cuts, and it's being made worse, of course, by COVID, right? there were the times were already tight in a lot of programs, but increasingly there's this push to emphasize why it is your department or your discipline is so important and necessary so that you don't get your funding cut. Our very livelihoods, our very existence in many ways depends on this funding. And so it's very much natural for us at this point to be like, we still matter, please give us money. Please.
If I only have a
Beg of
quarter
you.
for every time someone said that about both PoliSci and classics, I would be a millionaire right now, I swear.
Yeah.
Okay, so I love everything about where this discussion has gone. This is like perfect. I want to bring it a
Yes.
little back though.
Yeah.
A little more personalized though. So
Yeah.
if you would tell people like, okay, so you said you studied authoritarian regimes. So now I want to get
Right.
into that because I personally, from knowing you for a while now, I think that's like the coolest thing someone could study. And I know we've had some great discussions about fascism, about authoritarians, about what it means in the context of today's world. So if you can just tell us all now a little bit about what that looks like, and then if you feel comfortable giving us a little hint about the dissertation, that would be great too.
Ooh, yeah. So, authoritarian regimes, specifically what I study are the institutions. And I think I've mentioned this a bit, but that is sort of like there are different paths you can take when studying authoritarian regimes. Some people study regime type, which is how do you categorize and put into neat little boxes, news break, flash breaking news. You can't put everything into a neat little box. But how do you categorize these types of, like, is it a monarchy? Is it a single party regime? Is it a competitive authoritarian regime? I'm sure we've heard this term, or an electoral authoritarian regimes. Competitive authoritarian regimes are kind of like the buzzword these days. A lot of regimes, a lot of countries are falling into that category. Where you have, democratic elections, but they're not fully democratic, and you have some repression or of dissent. You don't quite meet the democracy standard, but you're not a democracy. You're not fully authoritarian. You're kind of in the middle. You're kind of a hybrid. Are you a military regime where you have, the main players are military members, commanders, generals, etc.? Or are you a personalist regime, which is basically the good old fashioned dictator, the one that you see, think, I'm thinking of people like Kim Jong-un, and, there are others, but that's probably the one that would be the most widely understood. There are people who study public opinion in authoritarian regimes, which, whether or not you realize it, they do ask people's opinions in authoritarian regimes. And there are people that study, transitions to democracy. So do these authoritarian regimes shift towards, how do they move from being authoritarian to being democratic? What are the processes that are going on in there? And this is broad strokes. Like, there are people that do so much more. And we don't have time to talk about any of, like, the dig really deep into some of what they do. But for me, I study institutions, and I study their constitutions specifically. So my dissertation focuses on whether or not they follow these constitutions that they have written in the post-Cold War era. So it's everything from 1990 onwards through about 2010, because at some point you have to stop, right? You have to write the dissertation, you have to make some calls. And I find that, generally speaking, authoritarians follow their constitution. There are instances where they don't, right? And that's to be expected in some countries. You don't expect all authoritarians to follow all the rules that they set out for themselves, but they generally do. And I go through and I have many different countries that I've gathered data on, and I've spent many a days. Much of my life has been looking for information on these countries, and it's specifically, are they following their executive rules, and are they following their legislative rules? And I find that they generally do. And I'm finding too that following the Constitution actually impacts the sort of trust that individuals have towards their government, towards their institutions. So do they trust the executive more? Do they trust the legislature more? If you follow the Constitution more. And it turns out a lot of times, if you're following the Constitution, it's going to increase the trust, specifically among the legislature, not as much among the executive. And so I'm trying to sort out exactly why that is. But that's sort of like the elevator speech of like, what is my dissertation? What do I find? What's exciting and interesting? But yeah, that's mostly what I'm focusing on right now, and that's sort of what I do on a day-to-day basis beyond teach.
That's awesome, though. I mean, and now that sprung up about 10,000 questions, which you don't have time for, but I'll try to pare it down as best I can.
Okay.
One, then, as someone who is going to study and become an expert in studying different constitutions for authoritarian regimes.
Mm-hmm.
So how easy or hard is it for an authoritarian regime now to just come in and sort of just change the Constitution, like blatantly just, what if we here in the States have an authoritarian come to power democratically and then just be like, all right, I'm just going to nix this, change that, blah, 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 and then I'm going to follow it. What does that do to a populace?
Right. So, I mean, there are instances where that happens, right? A lot of times that will happen around a coup, which is where the military is basically like, nope, no more. That's it. We're done. And we're going to institute a new constitution. There are other times where that sort of change happens thanks to elections. So you'll have, an authoritarian in power for decades. And they build the Constitution to remain in power. And then by some happenstance, all of a sudden, now you have this new ruler in power, and they're like, all right, we're gonna change the Constitution. But in general, they don't scrap the Constitution and start fresh all the time. I think it's easy to think that authoritarians are just going to, like, as soon as the Constitution isn't working for you, scrap it, start over, we're done. Like, that's it. If they're going to change things, what seems to be the common strategy is to make small adjustments here and there. So I think of Russia, where recently Putin, this was back, I think in June or July, adjusted where power was so that he could remain in power, so that he would be the executive who remained in power. So there are restrictions on how many terms that he can run for, but if you move where the power is, then you just run for this other office or whatever, bada bing, bada boom, you're still in power. There are, they'll extend and remove term limits and restrictions so that they don't have to change the whole Constitution, right? They only have to change specific things and make minor adjustments so that they can remain in power, and then use it to their advantage. So they're not necessarily scrapping it all and starting fresh. That's a lot of work. That takes a lot of work. And if you did that enough, the Constitution would no longer matter, right? Like at that point, does it even matter if you're just scrapping it? Like, it wouldn't have the same sort of legitimacy that it would have if you just make these minor modifications. So generally, they're not scrapping it and throwing it away. Usually, they're just making these small little adjustments along the way so they can remain in power. And, by no means, my research doesn't focus on, do they follow it like with respect to human rights, with respect to all of these other things. I can promise you they'll have things about human rights, or I've seen equal pay things in constitutions, different things like that. I don't study that, so I would be willing to tell you, and I don't think I'm going out on a limb here, that there will be human rights abuses and they don't care about that aspect of the Constitution. What they do care about are the rules that keep them in power and the rules that reinforce that they're in power and their place in the society as leaders, as the elite, as those in power, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, and when you say like small changes, are these changes so small that most of the populace is just not aware that what they're changing even existed? Like, how do you, because I know in this country, at least, we have a lot of watchdogs. We have a lot of people who kind of scan the Constitution. So any little minor change we try to do, but if it changes something that will impact us down the road, we are lucky enough to live in a place where, hey, we have people being like, you're doing what now? Wait, I know this is some like
Right.
obscure clause, but we see what you're trying to do. For some of these other countries, like take Egypt.
Right.
When the coup happened and LCC
Yeah.
got in power, obviously he didn't scrap
Yeah.
the whole thing, but
Right.
you know, is it just they don't have the infrastructure, or they just don't have people who are politically engaged enough to be able to spot these little changes?
So a lot of times, ironically enough, they do these changes via referendum. So they have the population vote on these things, right? So they build legitimacy to these changes by putting it up to vote for these people, right? So you have, I believe in Egypt, last year, I think it was, LCC was extended, like the term allowed to be in power was extended. It was constitutionally extended through referendum. So you have a lot of these adjustments, and they're doing it in the open, to where like literally asking the people, will you vote for this? Will you, you know, they're giving them a kind of like an into the system itself and into buying into the legitimacy. Like this is their sort of being able to vote for it, whether or not it's free and fair, and whether or not those are the actual results, right? Like if you see 99% of people approved of it, I would probably tell you that's baloney. But they do put these things up for vote a lot of times. It's not just that, you know, they're just making this adjustment and this change. It's
So
they let people buy into it.
Right. So it seems like is it so it seems kind of like on a just a much larger scale, but it seems like it's that old human thing where if someone wants something desperately, and then you try to devise a clever way of you know, getting a friend, a colleague, a parent, something to realize, hey, this would be a good idea. I have an idea. Let's do this. And you're like, job complete. I have put it, you know, sown the seeds. So
Yeah.
I'm going to make you think that it's your idea, even though it's really not coming from you. But now everyone will buy in because you've bought in, just on a larger scale.
I think so. Yeah. If you can get to where the population is buying into your rule, then you're winning, right? Like if you are changing it to where you can basically be president for life and people are cool with that, then yeah, it's making it seem as if it was their idea, and that they're so happy, and you're going to just stay in power forever. Yeah.
So, okay. So I know you study obviously more Constitution, so this part may be a little further afield than you're able to go, but I'm going to ask anyway because it's fun.
Yes, of course.
Looking at a lot of these regimes, just because you've looked at more foreign countries and their systems of government than anybody I know of currently.
Yeah.
How do most of these dynasties, regimes, whatever you want to call them, whatever they are in their own countries, how do they climb to power? You know, and is it because they're all suddenly fascist and they're all just like stirring up this nationalist fervor where they're like, we want to be pure, we like our people only, we don't like foreigners, go away? I'm just wondering, like, what kind of thing propels these people to the front? You know, they must have some powerful like PR campaigns, because otherwise you'd be like, that's completely stupid. I mean,
there's definitely some push among them to really sell this idea that they're a strong leader, right? You know, I'm trying to think of examples. A lot of leaders come to power, especially new authoritarians. They come to power through elections. I think of Erdogan in Turkey. He came to power free and fair elections, and has since sort of deconstructed and removed a lot of these democratic things to stay in power, right? Like you start limiting opposition, you start limiting all of these things, and all of a sudden, there you go, you know, bada bing, bada boom, you're an authoritarian. But some of these authoritarians have come to power at the given, like at the end of colonial rule. there were conflicts of some sort, civil wars, and they just happened to be the one that rose to the top. Some of them were a part of the party structure, and have also worked their way to the top. So I think in China, you have the Communist Party, and you have this Leninist party model, which is very hierarchical, very much like this. You have this person above this person above this person, and it sort of follows up, and you just work your way through it. So there's not necessarily one way in which authoritarians come to power. How they stay in power, though, a lot of it is built around building up this idea of legitimacy, building up this idea that this person needs to remain in power, and in many ways sort of creating what is called like this cult of personality. It's not always created, but there's this cult of personality, which is, sort of selling to the people that you are the father of the country, that you are somehow the greatest, and that you shouldn't be questioned, and that you are all knowing. And it's really built with a lot of propaganda, a lot of imagery, a lot of posters. I think you see it a lot during the Cold War, in Russia, in China, but autocrats today still use imagery as a way to show their power and to remain in power.
And that's really powerful. I love that you brought us here. Thank you for doing all of my work for me. It has been great.
Of course.
Because with symbols, well, as someone who studies a lot of ancient civilizations and ancient symbols are really powerful. We've talked about the power of symbols before. I know we have, and we've had some really great conversations about them.
Yeah.
So kind of with that, do they make their own? And I think we've talked about this as well, because making your own new thing is really, really hard when it's easy to take something from the past that has already some certain connotation and use that to sort of be a stand-in for whatever ideas you're supposedly going to be spouting and selling people on. So when I talk about when you see, well, let's take the Roman eagle, right? The Nazis co-opted that and took that for sure. I mean, the new Roman eagle. And so today, in today's movements, are there other countries out there who also want to use the eagle because it just kind of connects it back to that idea of Roman power? Or there's so many different symbols. I mean, the swastika really comes up. So I suppose if you're some radical fascist who believes in white power, you're going to be like, well, I don't want to create something new. I can just use this.
Yeah. I mean, why create something new when you have something already ready to go? You don't have to be creative. You can tie into that, whatever that was. Maybe. So, I think that you used the swastika. That was a great example. But, not just that, the straight R salute that Nazis did was, from Rome. Some of this imagery is really, it's powerful. And if you have it from the past and it's a powerful image, it really kind of gets you emotionally, right? Like you have that connection, especially if you're predisposed to particular ideals and beliefs. Like if you are a white nationalist and you see a swastika, that's probably going to create some sort of reaction in you. And so some of that imagery is used to show strength, right? To show power, but also to get some sort of, I think, emotional response in people. And you're not having to create anything new. You already have this history there. You can just tie into it and say, we're going to use this history and we're going to make it better, or, fulfill whatever past goals some previous civilization had or previous group had with this particular symbol.
And is it because it's kind of the goal of all authoritarians that they are so greedy for power, and they do want to connect and sort of create this bridge, this natural inheritance almost from the ancient to the modern, whoever used these, because it's the same repeated symbols. So why is it that certain symbols are just sort of co-opted, misappropriated, and are repeatedly used now to symbolize hate and other things? So you don't see people taking the American peace symbol, right? It's the circle with the whatever. Everyone knows what that looks like. Right. But why is it that we don't see people using that? But then it's always repeatedly Germanic runes, the Celtic knot, Thor's hammer, especially combining my own sort of interest in research with a modern political sort of look at all this, which is the far right really corrupts and uses and misappropriates a lot of Norse symbols to symbolize white power. We saw it with the Capitol riots, the QAnon shaman dude had Mjolnir, Thor's hammer tattooed on him. He had the ash tree, the tree of Yggdrasil, which symbolizes Odin, and he was just missing a raven. But I mean, technically, he had the Valknut, which symbolizes Odin anyway. So, why is it repeatedly certain cultures and certain things from ancient times, but only those that are recycled? I'm like.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you on that. I think that it's probably out of, dare I say, expediency and maybe a bit of laziness, that you're not creating anything new. You're just co-opting some previous ideology or some previous belief. And so you just keep using it because people know, like, I'm not sure the marketing strategy that would be, for someone in a, a white supremacist group, but you're probably not going to go out of your way to create something all that new, right? You would have to be like, oh, this is our new symbol and we're starting it here. You heard it here first. They're probably just saying, well, we know that, this group uses it and it seems to be effective, whether or not it's accurate, or I don't think they're thinking too deeply into this. They're probably too preoccupied with other terrible things that they're working on, and just being bad individuals. So they're not really digging in to see the history of it or if they're actually using it correctly. Instead, they're just like, well, we're just going to use this symbol because it works. And that's likely the sort of rationale that's probably going through their head, though I don't really talk with, at least I hope I don't talk with white nationalists on a daily basis. I don't want them in my life, to be fair, to be clear. So we can extrapolate from the sort of what you would assume would be going through their brains, not actually knowing what goes through their brains because they're bad people. So
I would hope that you don't talk to white nationalists. I hope I don't either. Not intentionally, of course.
Right.
Certainly.
Right. If there's anyone in my life and I find out they're a white nationalist, bye. Go, please. Don't ever talk to me again. Thank you. But bye.
And if you hear it here on the podcast and that's you, bye.
Yeah, leave.
You don't even have to tell me.
Just stop talking to me.
Right. You can just poof away. Bye.
Let yourself out the door. Please bye. I don't have room for you in my life. If you see the error in your ways and decide to no longer be a white supremacist or a white nationalist, come back and we will help, get you back into normal society. But if you're, just bye. If
you're far gone, it's okay. Just go in the QAnon corner. They'll take you.
Yeah, which is really, really unfortunate that what a world we live in today.
Right. And it's interesting because they're not too imaginative. I don't think they're just co-opting other symbols. No. What is it? Their shirt is like a big Q and then you use the American eagle. So I'm like, so you're trying to co-opt the American eagle, which should be for all Americans, all of us.
Right. Yeah. They're so stuck on listen, man, that was an inside job. That they're not thinking too far beyond, insert whatever was an inside job or the Illuminati or any sort of conspiracy that's just wild. They're more focused on that conspiracy than really being too creative with their symbolism.
Well, I would say the difference between a smart authoritarian or a smart fascist and a dumb one is the dumb ones aren't going to be too concerned with what symbols. They're just going to use, look, swastika scares people, that makes me feel happy, so I'm going to use it. But the difference between a really scary and a really smart fascist, though, wouldn't you think that if you were going to try to start your own fascist regime on a new island where you're being selective, wouldn't you think that person, though, would probably look into some of the deep histories of these things because of these connotations and build that mythology around some of this mythology?
Yeah, I think if you are, if say this is a hypothetical situation in which you are a smart authoritarian trying to build your own regime, um, yeah, I think you would look more into the sorts of symbolism that you're using. Is it a proper symbol? Is it accurate? Does this actually depict what I want to portray to the world? But I'm not sure that most authoritarians would do that. I think they're more worried about getting power and staying there than is this accurately using the symbol, if that makes sense.
It almost brings up like a question of, because you're more concerned on achieving that power, and then once you're there, when you turn to how do I hold it though, maybe could that lend to why authoritarian regimes, as long as some of them have gone on, they always crash on their head, right? They always implode. We haven't found one that's been able to really stick for a real good and long time. I mean, there's some that have been in power for quite a while, but I just feel like with that non-attention paid to how do you fully keep your power by building up this great mythology that won't just eventually crash on its head the moment someone dies, or some calamity happens and then that shakes their faith in whatever mythology you've come up with. I mean, if you really kind of did a deep dive into the material and the history there, I feel like maybe that would lend to some really long lasting authoritarian regimes. But
it could, but it may not necessarily, right? The problem with some authoritarians is they don't outlast the ruler, or they're unable to keep people happy, and that leads to a new ruler who's probably also authoritarian. Not always. Sometimes they democratize, and a lot some of these regimes do last a long time. I mean, I think of China. It's been an authoritarian regime now for a very long time, and has outlasted a lot of other authoritarian countries. Part of that has to do with the sort of setup that they have. It's very, very institutionalized, which means the processes are there and they keep going through with these processes. But if we think about the sort of propaganda and cult of personality that are built around these people who are in power, at some point, if you are unhappy as an elite or as a population, no amount of, and I'm sure that there's like like an amount, right? But generally speaking, if you're unhappy and you don't want this person to be in power anymore, it doesn't matter what your symbols are, or what your how mythical you may seem. If you're starving, or there's something that's going on, or you want to be in power, you're going to do whatever it takes to be in power or to change the situation. So
true. These are more just at this point musings of the theoretical. If I were to become some sort of raging authoritarian, how would I build my own island of I don't know. I don't plan to do that, so luckily that's not really going to be an issue. But
I would probably honestly build a country similar to China, where it's very institutionalized. You have processes that are there. You allow local elections, but the party is really in control of everything, and it's really effective. It's really stable, and you can allow economic development. That it does not necessarily mean you're going to democratize. That you can remain in power, and it's effective. It's so effective what China does. So yeah. But I'm not going to build an authoritarian polity anytime soon. I don't have. First of all, I don't have time. Second of all, I don't have the energy to do such things. But if I did, I would be effective with it.
Oh gosh.
And I would properly use symbols in my ideology.
Teach a interesting new version of history, I suppose, as well. The Roman Empire never actually died. Here it continued underground.
Look at this.
Secret through us. Yeah. I am somehow a descendant of Julius Caesar and Augustus. Okay, love me.
Yeah, it's because I ate a lot of Caesar salads, and that is how. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Oh yeah.
I honestly, sometimes if you talk about politics and the political situation and regimes the right way, you can have way too much fun. Like it's
You
completely
can. Yeah.
awful, but you can have
Yeah.
way too much fun in a way where I'm like, I'm having so much fun, but is this right? Oh my gosh, I'm talking about such horribly morbid things. I mean, my desk has a stack of like 8 or 9 books on it, and every single title is like fascism or nationalism or the great solutions for this horrible nationalist party. Yeah, I've come to realize now
Yeah.
we're very masochistic. Like we
Yeah.
like torturing ourselves by reading this horribly depressing literature where then for the next week all you want to do when you talk to anyone is be like, guess what I learned, and this is what I read, and this is completely scary, and then everyone else just kind of goes, okay, I don't want to be rude, but like no one cares if you're in tears at like 3 a.m. over the state of the world.
Yeah. So it's very important if you study these sorts of really difficult topics to have a good work-life balance. And you learn over time that at some point you have to stop and you have to read something lovely and fluffy and delightful and heartwarming, or take up a hobby outside of studying about terrible people. I read a lot for my my degree and for my dissertation and research, and I find myself being like, oh, I'm going to go read this book for fun, and then very quickly it's no longer fun. So I've had to establish some of these healthier boundaries in my life between reading about maybe I don't know, an authoritarian regime or a particularly terrible autocrat, and reading a delightful book about, I don't know, like I recently read last year I've been expanding beyond, academic reads, and beach read is great, as is red, white and royal blue. They were lovely. They were delightful. I did read Animal Farm thinking it would be a leisurely read, but I remembered reading it in high school and I was like, well, now I study autocrats. I should read this. Don't do that to yourself. Don't read it. It's depressing. And I realized after I finished Orwell, I was like, why is it every time I finish Orwell, I just feel angry and sad? And then I was like, oh, it's because Orwell makes you angry and sad. I felt the same way after 1984. Yeah. So read it with caution. They're literary classics, but just light reading material should be light reading material. Prepare yourself if you're reading something dystopian.
Yeah, I don't think I would read like Orwell and then immediately pick up To Kill a Mockingbird. Like, it's a classic. I love it, but don't save yourself. Don't do it. Don't do it.
Right. It would be too terrible. Yeah. It's
like you can inflict real trauma on yourself by picking up the wrong thing.
Yeah. I mean, people were telling me, and I think I read it it was like 2018 or 2019. I read 1984 and I thought, everyone tells me, read this book, Rach. You study dictators. You should read this book. And I was like, oh, Orwell is great and is gifted in his writing. And it just is really depressing. And it really can inflict some trauma on you if you're not careful. It's fascinating, and it's a really great way to think about how authoritarians behave. And it's great if you look at it from like an academic standpoint, but if you think about the implications of some countries have leaders who do these sorts of things, it's not nearly as leisurely and as intriguing. It's depressing.
Well, that, and then of course, I think it takes a very special kind of person to be able to even read this type of material. I mean, for most people I know, they find it interesting, they can barely get through like one Wikipedia article, and then they're like, I'm too depressed. I need to stop. And then you're like, try reading 3 books in a row on like authoritarians and dictators and fascists.
Right. Sometimes the most effective strategy that I've found when reading about and studying this sort of thing is really focusing on, I'm going to read this, but I'm not going to necessarily think about the implications this has for individual people. Like I'm going to think, and the reason I study institutions is because I don't normally branch out beyond, elite behavior. I don't look at like repression and human rights abuses, because it's really, really depressing. And when you really dig down into it, I did do some work in the past on it, and I was just like, this, I don't know if I could do this every day, because it's so
Start
upsetting.
crying. Yeah.
Yeah. But you learn sort of how to, and I don't know if it's just you desensitize over time to it, or you learn how to separate. I'm in academic mode, so I'm not really feeling strong emotions towards something. It's probably not healthy to shut down your emotions when you're reading something, but we also have sorts of strategies that we utilize to get through things.
The advice I'll give you then is, as someone who's read, I'm slowly gonna catch up eventually. I have a ways to go, I'm sure. But as someone who started with the ancient civs, the ancient political thought, and all the wars and the struggles that the ancients went through, that's a different kind of unique pain, also because you get the benefit of history, so you know what happens. As you're reading about the Sicilian expedition for Athens, you're like, if only I could go back and tell you dumb fucks, just like, don't do it. Like, objectively,
it's a trap.
Work.
It's a
like
it's a trap. Don't do it.
I was like, you ended your freaking power over the Aegean because you decided to make stupid moves, a horrendous campaign. You lost, and then all your colonies along the coast of Turkey, which at that point was still Anatolia, they all rose up, and then y'all lost your fucking power. So that's its own unique kind of thing. And what I would recommend for anyone who's like, I like poli-sci and I like classics, maybe I should do both. I will say it's kind of like a pick your poison. So read some depressing modern stuff, or you can start with the ancient stuff, with which arguably for some people it's not as depressing. It's just history, which is cool to learn about. But if you do it in a certain way, it's just as political as picking up any book now, which can just get you in tears and be like, I don't want to do this. So choose carefully. And
I think you make a really good point in that, if you're studying autocrats of today, there's some uncertainty there. You don't know what's going to happen. And so the level of stress, believe me, there are days where it is just kind of, you just have to go, I can't, this is outside of my control. I can only care so much about this, and I can only do so much about this. So I can't really get so invested in it that I'm so stressed out and depressed. Not to say you can't, be sad about, some authoritarian takeover or whatever. But there is a different level of stress and a different type of stress between where your focus is and where my focus is.
Someday we're going to have to do some kind of book exchange where you just got to give me something like really serious about authoritarian power or whatever. And then I'm just going to give you like one of these treatises I have from the ancient world. We're going to have to do some kind of like reading exchange where then I'd come back and be like, okay, Rach, so what do you think? Is this more or less depressing than what you do?
I'll probably be like, this is great. It was such a great, so enjoyable. And then you'll be like, why are you reading this? What is wrong with you? Why did you give me this? Are you okay? And I'd be like, no, but it's okay not to be okay.
Oh, I would love this. Okay, we got to set this up, man. I got to find something for you. Just find like the most depressing parts of like Thucydides or something, and be like, here, read this. Or, I suppose it's a different kind of pain. You can spread it out. Some of it's political from looking at some of the histories. Some of it's just like, hey, do you want to read some Hesiod? Because he just like slams on women. So if you were like, what did he think of women? He calls them like cows and sheep and horrible like temptresses. And you're like, oh, okay, this is great.
Wow. What an adventure. That sounds like that'll be so good for my mental health to be called a cow or whatever. Yeah.
So
cool.
Horrible.
No, I mean,
so depressing.
Yes.
Yes. I love everything about this conversation, as horrible as it is. This is why I recommend everyone get themselves a friend who studies either like horrible authoritarians or fascism or just PoliSci in general, because then you can go off on great tangents and have a lot of fun theorizing about horrible scenarios that may or may never come true. But the last thing on this topic I want to ask you about, serious question though.
Yeah.
I'll try to be serious.
Okay.
Is so what would you say to that naive person who says, if it's that depressing, why the fuck do you want to read this? Just put it down. Don't read this. And if politics depresses you or all it does is make you angry, don't do it. Like, that's so terrible. You're forcing yourself to be this horribly unhappy person. You should just not do that.
Right. I mean, listen, for those of you that don't really know me, I'm an optimist. Like, the glass is always full. It's not even half full. It's full of water and air, depending on exactly where you're at. So there's always a bright side, and I try to find the silver lining in everything. And that's sort of, and I try to laugh at a lot of different things, and that's sort of how I get through life, right? That's been my coping strategy through life, is to be optimistic and to have a sense of humor. It's normal when you're reading terrible things for it to make you sad and make you depressed. If it didn't, and you found immense joy in it, I would be very worried about your either mental status or are you okay? Because that would terrify me. If you're over here like, yes, I loved reading about X, Y, or Z because I loved the process. Like, I think about reading in school, we read about Foucault and, some of the torture and different things. And it's terrible, right? Like, it was painful to read, and it was not fun at all. And I don't go back to that anytime. Like, it's not like I'm like, I can't wait to go read more of this stuff about, awfulness. But for me, whenever I'm reading about these terrible things, and I'm researching and teaching about, the terrible things that autocrats do, I always try to remind myself that I still enjoy learning about it. I don't necessarily it can be depressing, but there's joy in the research process. There's joy in discovering something new. And if we don't understand these autocrats, we're missing understanding a large segment of the world, right? Like, recently I was reading that there are now more authoritarian regimes in the world than there are democracies, for the first time since 2001. And that in itself really reiterates that we need to understand autocrats. We need to understand why it is that we're making this shift towards authoritarian regimes over democracies. And it may be depressing, but the implications of it are so much bigger than maybe feeling sad or depressed by a topic. The implications are the world needs to know more about this. And it's something that I am passionate about. And so I want to do this. I want this to be my thing. I want to continue to research this. There are days where it's a lot and it's depressing, but most of the time, if I'm having a day like that, I just kind of stop, do a little self-care, just sort of separate myself from it and start back again the next day. But it's necessary work that, even if it's depressing, even if it's upsetting, it still needs to be done. And we still need to, strive to help create a better world and governments that work for people, that are more effective.
Couldn't put it better myself. I mean, I will also say it probably helps that you have a bunch of political friends that you can sort of vent to and and all that good stuff. I mean, I couldn't imagine tackling half of what I tackle alone. I mean, that's just yet another reason that I love PoliSci people, and I have a bunch of other friends who also love international issues and all that entails. So those people are kind of indispensable now. I mean, if something happens, I can literally just text up a bunch of people and be like, "Did you see this? What are you feeling? This is how I'm feeling," and we got it. Like, we're good.
Yeah, you build a community around you to help process some of these more difficult topics.
Yeah. And that's honestly one of the great reasons that, for those of you who don't know, I met Rach here through Model UN. We staff the same Model UN conference. that I participated in all as an undergrad. And I got there and I said, these are my people. They're very political, very political. But we all get along, and we all share and talk about these things.
Yes.
But also, just kind of with that, to tack on the end, do you think that studying politics is a privilege, kind of? Because I know a lot of people who are kind of like, oh yeah, we have politics in our everyday life and we can sort of pay attention to this whatever nominal level that we want to. But for some people, they say, well, studying that is really a privilege because I don't want to, or it's hard.
I think a lot of what I have in life is great. I've had so many opportunities that I am immensely grateful for. And there is a privilege to be able to get your PhD that I have to acknowledge, right? As a white, highly educated woman, there's privilege there. And so I always have to be cognizant of that, to recognize that. But I think, there are people who don't necessarily want to pay attention to politics, who don't really want to understand politics, and that's up to them. They're able to have that opinion. But I think it's so important that's why I do it, right? That this is my passion, that it's so important to know and understand the world around us, that's my calling in life, I think, to research and to understand these things, but also to teach it and help create better citizens in the world who do care about government, not just authoritarian regimes, but democracies. They find something they're passionate about and they go and be the good that they want to see in the world. John Lewis, the late John Lewis, he said, democracy is not a state, it's an act. And so for me, I have this privilege to be able to study the world and to study politics. And I'm going to use that privilege for good in the world. And I'm going to use that platform to help build people that care and are passionate about different things, about making the world a better place. And I'm going to use that privilege for good and just create a better society. You can't do it all, right? There's, what's that saying? That you can't do everything, but everyone can do something. Mm-hmm. So I want to help build better citizens around me, to make the world better and use the good and the opportunities and privilege that I've received to help just make better people, build better citizens.
Well, that's just beautiful. And I'm over here like, I'm going to cry. And I love it because more than any other topic, as I've said multiple times throughout my life and probably on the podcast by now, I really feel an affinity for classics, the ancient world, ancient studies, humanities, and politics, because they are so closely related. And it's part of why I thought what you just said was really beautiful, was because I see myself in the same way in the context of, with my background with studying the ancient world, which is we both occupy this unique role where we kind of contextualize a lot of what is going on now versus what happened, for people who don't necessarily feel that they have the opportunity or the privilege to study these things, or even if they don't have the interest. We're kind of the guardians of the past and of guiding the future. So there are so many reasons why that's beautiful. So I would love to become a professor myself. I don't know what or where I will land in that yet, because I'm still grappling with some of the applicability issues and the where do I fit in, what subject do I feel like this is where I should become the expert. I think it's awesome that you are where you are, and so I'm really excited to see you finish and become a doctor. And I'm gonna say that from all the great kernels of wisdom that you've shared with us today, any student you've had is lucky to have you as a teacher, because you just offer such great things to say. So I always just love our conversations, because I'm like, I learn so much at the same time that I get to sort of be my zany self spouting off all these different theories. So with that, at the end of every podcast, I have every guest read Percy Shelley's poem Ozymandias, because it is, well, my favorite poem. But I think that anyone who is into the ancient world or politics, honestly, would love the poem. Just because it evokes such strong feelings. It's pretty short, but it still has the power to really capture our imagination. And it's a short way that can sort of capture really powerful, timeless emotions in a way that a more concise way that some of these epic poems that classicists read. So, we talk about the Aeneid or the Iliad and Odyssey all the time. These are very long epic poems, but a short 14-line sonnet to me, if it's written, crafted well, it can kind of do the same thing. So yeah, if you could read it and then just give me your thoughts, like what does it make you feel like? What is the first thing that comes to mind? I love these quick reactions.
All right. I met a traveler from an antique land who said 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survived, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fled. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of the colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Ooh.
So
that's enjoyable. It's very nice.
It is Percy Shelley's best work, and I think for a lot of people, Ozymandias is like a word that they're familiar with, but they don't know it's a poem because people I've noticed put it in titles and stuff, and then they don't explain, and so then all you see is just like Ozymandias is a word, and then you're like, huh?
Yeah, that was delightful. Very, very powerful for sure.
So from your perspective as a political scientist and not as an ancient scholar, is this poem just a beautifully worded poem, or does it carry a lot of weight behind it, do you think?
I think poetry is powerful. And very quickly, words can exude sorts of emotions and feelings, and you get this heaviness with it. I think it's more than just a few words. There's power behind that poem. It's one of those poems that I would like just to sit down and read a few times and just really dig in. And I think that's the beauty of poetry, right? That there's so few words ultimately, but each word is important and has this distinct meaning to it, that it's picked and selected for that very specific purpose. And the rhetoric around politics is very similar, right? You use very specific words, and your terminology matters and your precision matters. And so I think it's powerful, and I think it really reiterates the importance of the words you use matter, and there's power in the words that you use and that you select.
Yeah, for sure. I don't remember exactly what age I was when I read the poem. I was probably in either high school or I definitely read it before college, but I just don't remember when. And the thing that stood out to me immediately was that it is a picture, a look at the hubris of man. It's also quite a strong statement on the ephemeral nature of political power, right? I tell everyone who doesn't know, Ozymandias is just the Greek name for the pharaoh Ramesses II. He was the most powerful pharaoh in Egyptian history and the richest, arguably the most decadent. And yeah, he was king of the world. He was on top back then when he was king. And what the poem is clearly saying is he thought he would last forever, right? He was a god made flesh. Mm-hmm. But when it says something so powerful as look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair, then the very next line is nothing beside remains around the decay of that colossal wreck. So he was great, right? But then it's all gone. I mean, he's saying, look at my empire. It's gone. It's buried under 3,000 years of sand. So it's kind of like, how great were you if it weren't for this lowly artisan who you probably, I don't know if he even paid him. I hope he would have paid him. But if it weren't for this artisan, would we even have a statue? Because we only know of him because of material evidence. His mummy, his statues, the fact that we find his name engraved on old ruins. If it weren't for all these people, the greatest person on earth would never have been known to man, which I love that statement. So kind of with that in mind, and I love this question at the end. It's become very quickly my favorite. Mm-hmm. If you're going off that definition of kind of the meaning of the poem, can you think of what to you is like a modern Ozymandias? Is there a modern Ozymandias? Because I love thinking about this. It's the best of the best, and it could be a person. So, with your political experience, you could say, I don't know, Putin. You could say a Trump Tower. One of my favorite examples that my former professor used earlier on the podcast was an abandoned casino in Atlantic City, because he was like, we thought those things were going to last forever and be the greatest thing. They're abandoned. They're just gone. It's a hollowed out ruin. I don't know. I've had some really creative answers on the podcast. Someone said technology. Someone said good deeds never go out of style. So while you can build buildings named after yourself, those buildings one day will crash, come down, be destroyed, something. But good deeds, how do you make yourself immortal is essentially, I guess, what I'm asking. Or can you never escape the fact that eventually you will be gone?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think of something that we think will always be around, maybe something as simple as democracy, that we think democracy will always be a thing. But what if we create something better? What if we create something new that's more effective, that's more true to represent the ideas of people, that someday we'll look and go, oh yeah, democracy, that was fun. I think that progress and moving forward in time means that things that are effective right now, things that exist now, they're all in so many ways contextual. And without acknowledging that, democracy is changing over time. Like what it means to be a democracy changes. And so I would say probably just political systems are going to change. They're not going to remain the same. And whether that's a good or a bad thing, that depends on your opinions and the context as well. But I don't think we can escape that everything will change, and that someday what is good now may be very different to what's good in the future and what's useful in the future.
I like that line of thinking. I think it's really interesting. 2,000 years from now, will democracy look anything like what it looks now? And my guess is no, because democracy now does not look anything like what the ancient Athenians said was democracy.
Right.
And I can think of a parallel to your answer would be like financial systems as well. We talk about capitalism a lot in this country, and a lot of people, I disagree with the notion that capitalism is the greatest thing on earth for multiple reasons, but a lot of people do think it's the best system that we have now. Obviously, if you're comparing that to straight up socialism or communism, there's a lot to be said for capitalism. Right. But yeah, what if we create something completely different that's not capitalism? It's different from everything else, and that's better. We can only look forward to a better day, and then maybe one day we'll look back and say, capitalism, that was an interesting thing.
What a trip.
Right. So I do like how you're thinking along the lines of sort of massive systems for humanity, really, because I would be interested to see how they change. And it's only a shame we're not going to be alive 2,000 years from now to be able to look back and say, what were they doing in the early 20th and 21st century? Man,
one can only imagine what's going to be written in history books about this time we're alive. It'll be interesting to see, to say the least. And, in the grand scheme of things, we are just a blip in time and a blip in society and in life. And we just are lucky enough to be right here, right now, living it up, leaving our little legacy for the future. No matter how vast our legacy is or how small our legacy is, we're still leaving it here to hopefully leave the world a better place.
Hopefully, better place than we found it. I mean, there's a lot to be said for all these ancient empires, which at the time were, I'm sure, the greatest the world's ever seen. And now, did all of them leave the world a better place for the future? Arguably, some say yes, some say no, some say I don't know. That's why we study these things. But yeah, it's been so fun to have you on, and thank you so much for agreeing to join me.
Of course.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient Odyssey. Next stop is Present Ponderings. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.